Thank you, Juliet. It's great to be here and fantastic to see so much interest. So I'm going to be really quick because it's 20 years of work in just 12 minutes. So I can get my skates on. So basically what I'm going to try and convey is how we've developed a model of stakeholder engagement, particularly with local communities, and how that's been used to manage conflict. I'm also going to very briefly touch on government because they're very important stakeholders in all of this, and no time for the rest of the stakeholders. But how did that happen? Right, so this is the study area. The brown squiggles show the elephant migration route just under that bend in the Niger River in central Mali. And there's a big diversity of habitats. We're talking of an area of sort of about 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers in the northern part of the Sahel. So you've got sand dunes in the north and then a much more wooded savanna, wooded and grassland in the south. But a very key habitat for the elephants is in the north, these small water holes, and they're surrounded by this thicket forest, really important refuge and very key to how this elephant population has survived when all the others around have disappeared. There's also a big diversity of people. We've got many different ethnicities, and they're all subdivided into clans and various strata, and they all have slightly different types of livelihoods, and they're living together in this space. And it's absolutely key too. So when I started in 2003, it was about how have these elephants survived when all the others have disappeared. We had collar data of a few elephants, and they were internationally important because they are so isolated and they just come across the border into Burkina Faso. There's probably about 500 of them, and they make this huge annual migration. So this is zooming in a bit to the migration and putting the collar data on top of a satellite image, and you can see the river Niger bending round at the top there. And the first thing that you notice, the key thing, is that they don't spread out across the landscape. They're very focused in certain areas where they spend most of the time, and then they move very fast between those areas. And that was the key in understanding this migration. And basically, as you might expect, they're trying to find food and water. They're picking their way through the landscape to find food and water through the year and avoid people as much as possible. And largely, they're spending the dry season, the long 9-month dry season in the north, in these water holes, and the wet season in the south, where the food is much, much better, but there's no standing water, there's no surface water. And then they're trying to avoid people. And what became clear after 3 years was how although this is a remote area, how the increasing population pressure, increasing human activities was encroaching on them and, threatening to sever their migration route. And if something wasn't done very soon, they would be gone in just a very few years. So, but what do you do? This manifested in conflict in different ways. Each of these spots had a slightly different suite of things happening. So it's largely to do with habitat clearance or large herds of livestock, crowding out water holes, drinking them dry. As I said, what to do? There were 2 ranger posts, 2 rangers, no vehicles, no government will, no resources, and it was not a protected area. It was a big, open, populated landscape. So obviously, people were a key, and what did they think? How did they understand elephants? And so the first idea I had was to identify stakeholders and just try to understand what they thought about elephants, and then try to build a shared vision about elephants around Mali. And so there was a lot of stakeholder engagement with local people, with government, with institutions, with projects, international donors, tourists, and we had awareness materials and schools education project, and that worked well, but it still somehow wasn't enough. We did attitude surveys, and this was our first engagement very local engagement with leaders, but we did discover 2 key attitudes which kind of gave me hope. And that was that there was a general desire to maintain elephants. They wanted to keep elephants because it meant that the environment was good for people, and they felt that they're all part of this integrated, people, landscape, elephants were all part of this unified thing. And they really understood this idea of physical limits, that human activity must be kept within physical limits. But if you looked at the environment, it was a highly degraded, and there was, a lot of problems. So what was going on? And what forced us to kind of take the situation further, to go deeper, was a crisis of water at the end of the dry season. The last water was drying up, so we really had to engage locally. And so we didn't know what to do, had no idea what to do. So we went and thought, well, let's see what the people think. How do they understand this problem? And so I hasten to add, I didn't do any of this actual community engagement. I had a very talented socio-anthropologist who was leading this work. And they interviewed everybody living around this lake to try and understand what was happening. And we discovered many surprising things. The first thing that was most of the degradation was coming from urban centres, sometimes 100 kilometres away, taking firewood. 96% of the cattle actually belonged to these commercial, distant, prestige herds that were coming into this area and, using its resources. But we also discovered that while each ethnicity and clans, they had systems to manage natural resources, they would not respect each other's. And so these systems didn't work. So what we did was brought them all together to feed back the results of what we'd found and ask them what they thought. And they would, but very much in the context of their own problems. So it always started, what problems do you have? And then feed in the results of what we found. And this was discussed until there was a unity of perspective. So this created a unity. They arrived at a common understanding of the problem, and then you can say, well, what needs to be done? So they say, well, we use our traditional structures but that everybody obeys. So not just limited to particular ethnicities and clans, everybody obeys. So that's basically what they established. They elected a management committee, and they elected the younger men to be patrols to ensure that the rules were respected. So this is as an example of what kind of benefits that brings. For pasture, they would protect big areas of pasture at the end of the dry season. When the fire comes through, they've still got pasture. They're able to sell the forage at the end of the dry season for premium prices, grazing access rights, the sale of hay. And we found that their livestock was worth 50% more at the market. And so this is very much seen as a local benefit. And they shared any revenues between the women, the management committee, and the patrols, the teams, young men. And this, as there's more natural resources saved, there's more opportunities for small income generating activities that are important because they make the difference of whether they can send their children to school or whether they can buy clothes for the children. So that has a big impact. It might not be much in cash, but for livelihoods, that's important. And so we use this model of community engagement to manage instances of conflict in a preventative way, because we're restoring degraded lands, preventing degradation, so there's more resources available, and it's making sure the migration route is kept free of any occupation and development. And also as a kind of reactive way. So as there are incidences of conflict, the team can visit, they talk to the people about what's happened, get them to work out why that's happened, what are the, and come up with, ways around it. There's a whole multitude of ideas that the local people come up with. And if there really is no way, then we help them do something else. So we were able to do this because Mali has decentralization legislation that's put natural resources under the control of local people, but they still needed help in enforcement on occasion. You get a big herd of cattle and heavily armed herders, they need help. And so right from 2011, we started working with government to designate a new protected area over the whole of this area. And the management, the legislation, was to support these local community agreements for all the areas apart from the core protected areas. So instead of the government having to try and manage this whole area, they would support local communities, but they would focus on the enforcement of the core areas, and we work with local communities on the core areas. So that took 10 years, finally designated in 2021. Everything was going so well. And, you know, I honestly think if the conflict hadn't happened, we would have that whole area under these systems and working really well. But conflict happened, and overnight we had poaching, completely lawless. It's now an insurgent zone, highly conflictual between people. Community systems were able to contain that poaching initially for 3 years through these systems, but eventually the epicenter came right into our area. It got extremely bad, and they requested government enforcement to help. Now, working with government on anti-poaching enforcement, extremely challenging. Very weak in a country with very weak institutions like Mali. It really relies on people, individuals. You know, when you have good people, you can really advance very rapidly. But when you have people who are not interested, you're completely blocked. And so it's a real matter of perseverance, and, you know, really trying to think laterally, look for your opportunities, look for ways around things. A lot of patience, you know, knowing that these people are going to change. Anybody wants to talk to me more about that, do. I won't go into it here. But really the key takeaways, I would say, for any of the stakeholders that we dealt with, and of course international aid agencies were a huge one as well, is seek to understand their perspective. You know, everybody does what they do, has their perspective for a whole set of reasons. So seek to understand that, and why, you know, what their motivation is. Listen, don't assume that you've understood the context, you've understood what's happening, because often there's a lot of surprises there. And give every element of what you're dealing with respect, even the people who are the biggest blockers and most difficult people. They also, you have to respect them because they're part of this whole thing. So what started as very much a science-based project, and it was focused on trying to leave space for elephants and manage conflict, as a result of this kind of approach, ended up in solutions, never say solutions when it comes to conflict, but improvements in conflict through improving livelihoods. It provided occupations for young men in particular, but youth, which is a huge problem in this area. You've got very high birth rates and a lot of unemployment, and this prevented radicalization because young men would prefer to do this work because it gave them local status, even though armed groups are paying them between $30 and $50 a day. They prefer this. It has more local status and is valued by the community. And also we found it improved social cohesion where there were conflicts between clans and things. And then, so there are multiple synergistic benefits that were unforeseen, actually, that arose because of this approach, I would say. And that also fed into when the poaching happened and there was a government enforcement unit. Poaching has been contained, and, you know, a large part of that is due to the fact that the poachers, the traffickers, they know that the community know what's going on. There's eyes and ears. We've got 1,500, eco guards across this area, all feeding in information. They know who poaches and that they can feed it into law enforcement because of this positive benefit. There's more detail in this paper that was published in 2021 in Environment, Science and Policy for Conservation of Sustainable Development. So that's it, my race through 20 years. Thank you so much for listening.
Well done, Susan, and thank you very much for presenting that really interesting model of community engagement. Any questions for Susan? Yes, Ida.
Well done. Before the conflict, you had people working together to keep pasture safe so it could be harvested as hay.
Sorry, is the microphone there?
So you had, before the conflict, you said there were areas that would be kept set aside so that the grass could be harvested as hay. And then you also talked about charging for access to the water. How well were those enforced, and what kept people from sneaking in at night and all those sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, that was the key point, was the enforcement. So, you know, the people who come to use those, and that was our next thing that we really wanted to do, was a breakdown on those migratory herds and who owned them, and then how do we reach the owners of those big herds, because that's a very key thing. So for a lot of them, it wasn't a problem. But sometimes you'd get, you know, armed herders who'd come from afar, and that was why. And then they would ask for foresters to come and, you know, armed foresters to come and help them to enforce that. And that was why. And that worked for a while. And then somebody pointed out, oh, but the foresters don't have a mandate to do that in law, because this is decentralization legislation. There's no enforcement agency for that. Which was why we then said, well, to get foresters to be able to help them do that enforcement, you need it in environment legislation, which is why the protected area on a biosphere reserve model, because that gives the foresters a mandate to do that. That's why we started working at the very same time, virtually, on trying to get that protected area. And so that's the idea.
Great. Thank you again very much, Susan.
Okay.